states reopening across the country, and a number of new coronavirus cases that have been reported worldwide because we've seen the biggest daily increase yet. The World Health Organization says over the last 24 hours, 106,000 new cases have been reported, and this comes as new data from Columbia University finds at least 36,000 lives could have been saved if the U.S. had imposed social distancing guidelines just 1 week earlier in March. Ben Tracy is following the latest on the White House's response to the pandemic, and Ben joins us now to talk about it. So, Ben, have you heard from anybody in the White House about the findings in this report?
We have, and predictably, the White House is not accepting any blame for those deaths. In fact, in a statement, the White House says that it's President Trump who saved many American lives by instituting that travel ban on China and then getting equipment and testing set up in the United States. Obviously, critics of President Trump would not agree with those version of events. But here they're basically saying we are not looking backwards, we are looking forwards. A senior administration official also says this isn't just about the federal government. You have to look at governors if you're going to talk about time that might have been wasted and that might have cost people their lives.
So, Ben, the president has sort of shifted his criticism back to China. What's he saying about how China is responsible for this?
Well, it's interesting. The president really has escalated his attacks on China in the last couple of days, especially on Twitter. That was part of the White House response to these new numbers, was saying that it's really China and the World Health Organization that weren't transparent enough, and that's why so many people have died, not because there was inaction here in the United States. But aside from that, the president now almost daily is really raising the rhetoric when it comes to China. One of the things that he said yesterday on Twitter, he said basically that China let this spread, that they could have stopped it. He said the incompetence of China led to mass worldwide killing, and it all comes from the top. That last part is significant because the president, even with all of his criticism of China, has not really made this personal with Xi Jinping. He likes to say, I have a good relationship with President Xi, and then blame China for not being transparent and not stopping this virus. But now the president in this tweet last night said it all comes from the top. And as we know, the top in that country is President Xi.
Interesting that in that particular case, Ben, the buck does stop with the premier in China. But when reporters ask President Trump about his responsibility, he generally shuns it. In fact, yesterday, there was a reporter during the press briefing or the press spray that the president delivered, mentioning that the U.S. has 4% of the world's population and 30% of the COVID-19 cases. The president was asked if there's anything that he might have done differently. Again, this is off of the back of that new analysis from Columbia University. The president, what did he say?
Well, you know, the president has basically said that he doesn't take any blame for any of that. He says he did everything perfectly. That's what he has said all along. And when you talk about the number of cases in the country, his response is, well, that's because we're doing so much testing, and that really that should be a badge of honor in this country. So the president is not one who is ever going to admit to any fault or mistakes. He consistently has said that he thinks he has done everything right.
So we know now that drug manufacturer AstraZeneca, I believe, has received more than $1 billion in U.S. government funding to help develop a vaccine. What more can you tell us about the role of the administration and what the expectation is in return for that money?
Yeah, so this seems like big news. This is a big investment in this vaccine. This is the vaccine that's being produced by the University of Oxford that has shown promise in early trials. And basically the U.S. government is saying, hey, we're going to give you a bunch of money to fast track this, and we're going to basically pre-order 400 million doses of this vaccine. This is part of what the U.S. government is doing with this Operation Warp Speed, where in their words, they say we're placing a lot of big bets on some of these vaccines. So they're going to invest heavily in vaccines that are not yet proven to work. While this Oxford vaccine has shown promise, there's no guarantee that it will actually work in human beings or that it could be mass produced. But the government is basically saying we're willing to spend the money to have several different vaccine candidates in the hope that one of those works, and then scale that up in terms of the amount of doses that we would need, not only in the U.S., but in other countries as well.
Ben, as you know, President Trump is expected to visit a Ford plant in Michigan today. The state's attorney general wrote a letter to the president saying he has a, quote, legal responsibility to wear a mask during his tour. The president has consistently appeared without a mask in public. So what message is the president of the United States sending by not wearing a mask? Given that the CDC guidelines recommend that it is feasible, the reason that we wear masks is to protect others around us and not necessarily to protect the individual who's wearing the mask. So do we know if he'll wear one this time?
Well, I don't know if you're a betting man, Vlad, but if you are, I bet you would vote that he won't. His history of these last couple of trips that he's taken, when there's been lots of speculation about whether he'd wear a mask or not, he has not yet been seen in public wearing a mask. And I've been told by several senior administration officials that the president and others around him don't think it's good for him to be seen wearing a mask, that it shows some sort of weakness or that he's overly concerned about the health implications of the virus. This particular visit today, though, is interesting because Ford has come out and said that they have told the White House that they have a policy of wearing a mask. The Attorney General of Michigan has come out and said, please wear a mask. We expect you to wear a mask. And the UAW, the union that represents the workers in that plant, has also put out a statement saying we expect the president to follow the rules just like anybody else. So there is perhaps more pressure on him today to do it than in the past. The president's been asked about this twice in the last couple of days. He's been very non-committal. He says it kind of depends on the conditions on the ground. He often will say, if I need to wear one, I'll wear one. It's no big deal. But he's never actually done it. So if he does do it today, it would be significant. Certainly, though, there is the mixed message of the White House and the medical advisors saying to Americans, you should be wearing a mask, and the president and the vice president routinely not wearing them. But the president, again, he has been consistent on this front. He has consistently not followed the advice of his own government.
It's just really, interesting. No, sorry, Emery. I was going to say to Ben, it's just interesting because the president, having spent most of his time in construction, when the president would go on construction site visits, he would wear the required headgear that you need to visit those construction sites. In fact, generally, there are very strict rules in visiting construction sites. You wear those helmets or that headgear to protect yourself from falling debris. He had no problem doing that. It's not, to me, any different. The only difference here is that by not wearing a mask and by flaunting the rules and by flaunting the regulations that have been put into place by these officials, you give license to other people to do the same, which puts everybody else at risk. Sorry, Emery.
No, I think you're right, and we know that he has been around people who have been exposed to the virus. So now more than ever would probably be a good time to don a mask.
Certainly. And, one thing to keep in mind on that front, though, this is beyond just the president worried about the health implications of this. He has a certain narrative that he's trying to tell right now. He has said we have moved to this reopening phase, that the threat of this virus has largely passed and people should get on with their lives. So him putting on a mask and looking like he is more concerned about it than he's letting on is not the message that he wants to send. So there is some method to the madness, if you want to call it that, but that does factor into his thinking on whether he wears a mask.
All right, Ben, thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.